Pick it up, the four-star said without raising his voice. And when you get to Washington, you use his clearance. Not his name. His code. We were standing just inside the base gate chapel. The place smelled like industrial floor wax and old paper. My dress shoes were still stiff from the funeral detail, collar tight against my throat. Cameras waited outside. The U.S Iran war had turned every retired operator into a headline. He didn't look at the press. He looked at me. On the podium between us sat a sealed brown envelope with my father's Department of the Navy ID clipped to it. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. People keep saying my father retired quiet, like it was a personality trait instead of a decision. He didn't retire quiet. He retired clean. There's a difference, and I didn't understand it until the record started talking back. Before Washington, before the envelope, before the war pushed his name into rooms it had never entered publicly, there was just our house and the structure he kept inside it. He believed in steady mornings. Shoes lined up parallel to the wall. Keys placed on the same ceramic dish by the door. Coffee measured, not guessed. Even the silence had discipline. What he didn't believe in was explanation. That left space for other people to write their own version of him, and the loudest version belonged to my Uncle Mark. Mark liked to say my father used to be something. He'd say it at barbecues while turning meat with tongs like a gavel. Used to be something. As if service expired. As if structure was a costume you returned after retirement. The first small humiliation happened at my cousin's graduation dinner. I had just finished my own enlistment paperwork and was waiting on a clearance review. Mark raised a glass and congratulated everyone who had real prospects. Then he looked at me and asked if I was still sorting out my direction. He said it lightly, clean smile, clean shirt, but he slid a folded 20 across the table like a tip for a waiter when I offered to help cover the bill. I left the 20 there. My father didn't react. He just adjusted the placement of his fork, so it aligned with the plate edge. Later that night, I found his trident pin on the kitchen counter, face down near the sink, as if it had been brushed aside with the mail. I picked it up and wiped it with the hem of my shirt. He saw me do it and said, "Steady. Metal doesn't rust from fingerprints. It rusts from neglect." The second humiliation was smaller, but cleaner. Mark had convinced my father to let him store some documents in our garage while he refinanced a property. One afternoon I came home and found Mark sitting on a folding chair beside my father's old sea bag, using it as a footrest while he scrolled through his phone. The bag had his name stenciled in black block letters. Mark's heel pressed against the letters like punctuation. I told him to move his foot. He laughed and said, "Relax. It's just canvas. Just canvas." I didn't argue. I carried the bag back inside and placed it under my father's desk. That desk was always clean. Top drawer, notepad, black pen, small flashlight. Second drawer, manila folders labeled in block print. No stories, no medals on display. Just record. Mark called it obsessive. My father called it structure. When the war with Iran started dominating the news cycle, Mark started talking louder. He had opinions about strategy, about oil, about how the old guys would have handled it. He said it in front of my father, as if commentary were contribution. The gossip started then. Neighbors whispering that Dad had been involved in things overseas. Someone mentioned Geneva, like it was a rumor you could touch. Mark leaned into it. He told people my father had probably sat behind a desk the whole time. I watched my father's jaw tighten once, then release. He never corrected anyone. That was his discipline. The quiet confrontation came 3 weeks before he died. Mark asked me to meet him at his office. He shut the glass door and lowered the blinds halfway, like a man preparing a negotiation. He said there were assets that needed to be handled professionally once my father passed. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a draft agreement naming him executor of all relevant holdings. My name appeared once, in a paragraph about family harmony. He said, clean voice, that I could receive a fixed monthly stipend if I signed early and avoided complications. I read the document twice. The margins were narrow. The language was precise. It was designed to look steady. I asked him why he needed my signature before there was even a will filed. He smiled and said it was about efficiency. I told him efficiency without authority is just speed. I closed the folder and stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "You don't have the bandwidth to manage what he built." Bandwidth? Like I was a weak signal. I walked out without signing. That night, I found my father's Silver Star citation photocopied and wedged under a stack of property tax notices in the hallway drawer. The edge was bent. I smoothed it out and placed it inside a clear sleeve. The next morning, he asked why I'd moved it. I told him records deserve clean storage. He nodded once. When he died, it was quiet. No long line of officials. No ceremonial theater. Just a folded flag and a name carved into stone. Mark moved quickly after the burial. He began organizing the house before the condolences stopped arriving. I came home one afternoon to find him in the study with the desk drawers open. He said he was cataloging for probate. His phone camera hovered over every page. I watched him flip through documents he didn't understand. He paused at a passport I had never seen. The cover was worn, but the pages were thick. I stepped closer. The stamps weren't tourist stamps. They were entry markings from places that don't show up on vacation lists. Geneva, Muscat, Ankara, dates that overlapped with years he claimed to be consulting locally. Mark whistled low and said, "Well, that's interesting." He slid the passport into his briefcase. I placed my hand on the case and said it needed to be logged before removal. He laughed and asked since when I was in charge of logging. Since always, I thought, but I didn't say it. Instead, I walked to the closet and pulled down a black military-grade Pelican case I'd never opened. It was heavier than it looked. 2 steel padlocks secured it, both aligned perfectly as if they'd been measured. Mark stopped smiling. He asked if I knew the combination. I told him no, but I knew how to read serial numbers. I flipped the case over and photographed the manufacturer code, then checked the underside for tamper seals. Clean, untouched. My father had written something in small block letters along the interior lip near the hinge. Not a name, not a message, just a sequence of numbers separated by hyphens. It didn't look sentimental. It looked operational. Mark said we should wait for legal counsel before opening anything. He reached again for the passport. I took it back and placed it on the desk, aligned with the edge, parallel to the grain of the wood. That was the moment the fracture became visible. Not emotional, structural. My father's life was not a rumor. It was layered, documented, sealed. And whatever that code meant, it wasn't designed for Mark's kind of transaction. The first door wasn't dramatic. It was fluorescent lighting and a ticket number printed in red ink. The Department of Veterans Affairs regional office sat between a federal credit union and a pharmacy. Beige brick, clean glass, flag at half-staff because of the war briefings running nonstop on cable. I took a number and sat in a molded plastic chair that rocked slightly on one uneven leg. Industrial cleaner hung in the air. A television in the corner scrolled headlines about carrier groups repositioning in the Gulf. I kept the Pelican case in my lap. The weight was steady. The passport was inside my jacket, left breast pocket, parallel to my sternum. When my number flashed, I walked to window 4. The woman behind the glass had her hair pulled tight, posture straight, voice disciplined. She asked for my father's file number. I gave her his last 4 and branch. She typed without looking at me. Her screen reflected faintly in the glass. I saw a red banner flash across the top of whatever system she was in. She stopped typing, looked at me, asked for identification. I slid my driver's license and the Department of the Navy ID from the envelope across the counter. Her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly when she saw the clearance designation printed in small text near the barcode. She scanned it. The red banner changed to yellow. She picked up a phone and dialed an internal extension without breaking eye contact. "I have a dependent with a restricted decedent file," she said. Restricted, decedent, clean words. She listened, nodded, hung up. Then she handed me a laminated visitor badge and told me to follow the blue line on the floor to Office 3B. The blue line was literal. Painted stripe running down the hallway, guiding you past posters about benefits and suicide prevention. Structured empathy on the walls. Office 3B had a metal desk and 2 chairs. A man in a suit that fit too precisely introduced himself as Mr. Halpern, Fiduciary Services. He didn't offer condolences. He asked if I understood what a protected beneficiary layer was. I said I understood layered security. He folded his hands and explained that certain veterans, based on classified service history, are enrolled in an asset protection structure that activates upon death. It shields holdings from immediate probate and flags any executor petitions for federal review. He slid a form toward me labeled VA Form 21P 4706C with additional attachments stapled in clean sequence. He said my father had pre-registered a contingency beneficiary with code-based verification. Not a password, a code. My pulse didn't change. I asked what verification required. He said 3 components: a numeric sequence tied to a service event, a travel corroboration, and a witness validation from a designated officer. I thought of the hyphenated numbers inside the Pelican case. I thought of the passport stamps. Geneva, Muscat, Ankara. I asked who had already inquired about the estate. He looked at his screen, said a Mr. Mark Delaney had filed an intent to administer petition that morning, citing a preliminary will draft. I kept my face steady, asked if the petition had been accepted. He said it was pending because of the federal protection flag. I asked what would remove the flag. He said verified compliance with the code protocol. He slid a yellow legal pad across the desk and said, if you believe you are the designated beneficiary, write the sequence. I didn't open the Pelican case. I didn't guess. Instead, I asked for a copy of my father's DD-214 and any deployment abstracts attached to his restricted file. Halpern studied me for a second, then printed a redacted summary. The dates were there. Specific operations, sanitized locations. One entry aligned exactly with the first hyphenated number in the case. April 17th, 89. I wrote 041789 without hyphens. He nodded once. Then he asked for travel corroboration. I removed the passport and opened to the Geneva stamp dated 3 days after that operation window closed. He compared the stamp to something on his screen. The yellow banner turned green. Final component, he said. Witness validation. He handed me a card with a secure email address ending in .mil. I recognized the name printed beneath it. The 4-star from the chapel. I stepped into the hallway and dialed the number on the card from the envelope. He answered on the second ring. I identified myself by last name and code reference. There was a pause. Then he recited a phrase my father used to say when checking locks at night. Doors are clean when they close flush. I replied with the rest. And records are clean when they close twice. He said he would transmit validation within the hour. I returned to Office 3B and sat without fidgeting. Across town, I knew Mark was probably meeting with a probate attorney, confident in paper that looked official but lacked federal weight. Halpern's computer chimed. He read the incoming message silently, then printed a single-page confirmation with a raised seal in the corner. He stamped it with deliberate pressure. The sound was sharp, clean. He turned the document toward me. It stated that the protected beneficiary protocol had been satisfied pending secondary review in Washington due to current wartime escalation. Secondary review. Washington. The stakes doubled in that single line. Halpern explained that assets under this structure often include contingency funds earmarked for operational continuity in the event of geopolitical activation. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The war had activated something my father anticipated. Halpern also informed me that because of the pending probate contest initiated by Mark, a notice would be sent to all parties that federal oversight had attached to the estate. He won't like that, Halpern said evenly. I replied that preference wasn't part of the form. Before I left, Halpern handed me a thick envelope stamped confidential and instructed me not to open it outside a secure environment. As I stepped back into the fluorescent hallway, my phone buzzed. A text from Mark. Heard you went to the VA. We should keep this in the family. I didn't respond. I walked out into the afternoon light, the blue visitor badge still clipped to my chest, the confidential envelope under my arm, and understood that the first door hadn't just opened. It had locked something into motion that would not be negotiated over folding chairs or whispered offers. Washington was next, and whatever was inside that envelope was no longer about inheritance. It was about activation. Washington smells different when you arrive with paperwork instead of ambition. The air inside the federal building was filtered, temperature controlled, faint trace of toner and old carpet. I signed in with block letters, last name first, printed steady, and clipped the temporary badge beneath the blue one from the VA as if stacking credentials created its own structure. The confidential envelope from Halpern stayed sealed under my arm until a staffer in a navy suit led me through a corridor that muted footsteps. No windows, clean walls. At the end was a conference room with a single long table and a digital recorder placed precisely at the center. A small red light blinked, not yet active. 2 chairs on one side, one on the other. I took the single chair. I set the envelope down parallel to the table edge and aligned it with the recorder. When the door opened again, Mark entered with his attorney. The attorney carried a leather portfolio thick enough to imply confidence. Mark wore the same clean smile he used at graduation dinners. He nodded at me like we were about to discuss landscaping, not federal oversight. A third person entered behind them, a woman with silver hair and a Department of Justice badge clipped at her waist. She introduced herself as Counsel Rivera, federal probate liaison, and stated that due to the wartime escalation and the activation of a protected beneficiary protocol tied to classified service, this hearing would determine preliminary control of assets pending full review. She pressed a button. The red light on the recorder went solid. For the record, she said, state your names. Mark spoke first. Confident. Transactional. I followed, voice steady. When it came time to describe my relationship to the decedent, I said son without embellishment. Rivera asked Mark's attorney to summarize their petition. He did it cleanly, citing a draft will naming Mark executor of non-classified holdings and arguing that federal flags were procedural overreach. He used words like efficient, streamlined, family intent. Rivera listened without interrupting. Then she turned to me and asked if I had documentation to counter. I slid the confidential envelope toward her, broke the seal along the top with one finger, and removed a stack of pages clipped with a black binder clip. The first page was a notarized affidavit signed by my father 18 months prior, witnessed by a JAG officer. The affidavit referenced a contingency clause triggered by geopolitical conflict involving the Islamic Republic of Iran. The date of signature aligned with the first sanctions flare-up that never made headlines. Rivera read silently. Mark shifted in his chair. His attorney leaned forward. I watched their posture change, small adjustments, less relaxed. Rivera asked if the code protocol had been verified. I handed her the VA confirmation with the raised seal. She examined the stamp, ran her thumb lightly over it as if testing the impression. Clean, she said almost to herself. Mark's attorney objected to the admissibility of classified contingencies in a probate setting. Rivera responded that federal law preempted state probate when national security designations were involved. Her tone never rose. The recorder continued its steady red glow. This was not drama. This was record. Mark tried a different angle. He said my father had been confused in his later years, that the affidavit might have been influenced by fear or misinformation about global events. Rivera asked if he had medical documentation supporting cognitive decline. He did not. She asked if he had evidence that the JAG officer witnessing the affidavit acted improperly. He did not. Silence followed, clean and structured. I could see the first crack in Mark's professional facade. Not anger. Calculation recalibrating. Rivera then asked me to explain how I obtained the numeric sequence used in the code verification. I described the Pelican case, the hyphenated numbers, the cross-reference with deployment abstracts. I did not embellish. I described how the Geneva passport stamp corroborated the service event. Rivera asked if I understood that by verifying the code, I accepted fiduciary duty under federal oversight. I said yes. Duty was not a metaphor. It was a line item. Mark's attorney requested a recess. Rivera denied it. She said the matter was procedural and clarity served all parties. She then introduced a new document into the record, a financial summary of the protected assets. The number printed at the bottom was larger than I expected, not because it was extravagant, but because it was layered. separate accounts designated for veterans' families affected by classified operations, educational trusts, emergency medical reserves. My father's holdings were not a pile of money. They were structured allocations tied to names I didn't recognize yet. Mark leaned back, exhaled through his nose, and said, "So this is about control." Rivera corrected him. "This is about compliance." The difference mattered. She then asked if either party wished to make a statement before preliminary determination. Mark spoke about family unity, about how he had always looked after my father's affairs. He said federal involvement was unnecessary and heavy-handed. When it was my turn, I kept it short. I said my father believed records outlasted opinions. I said the war had activated a clause he anticipated. I said my only interest was executing the structure as written. Rivera nodded once. Before she turned off the recorder, I leaned slightly toward it and said, not to Mark, but to whoever would later review the transcript, that if you care about honor, you subscribe to the record, not the rumor. It wasn't a speech. It was a statement of alignment. Rivera pressed the button. The red light went dark. She announced that preliminary control would remain under federal protection pending a formal hearing scheduled in 72 hours, where sworn testimony from designated witnesses would be entered permanently. Mark's attorney began gathering papers too quickly, edges misaligned. Mark stood slower than before. As we exited the room, he stepped close enough that only I could hear him. He said we could still resolve this privately. He said Washington chews up people who don't understand how it works. I looked at the clean lines of the corridor, the badge clipped to my chest, the documents under my arm. I told him Washington respects structure. Outside, the sky was overcast, low clouds pressing down on the Capitol dome in the distance. My phone buzzed with a calendar notification for the formal hearing. 72 hours. Enough time for rumors to spread, for gossip to twist the narrative, for Mark to try one more angle. But the record had started, and once the record starts, it doesn't forget. The hearing room was smaller than the conference room, which made it more serious. No long table this time, just a raised bench, 2 counsel tables, a court reporter with a machine that clicked in disciplined bursts, and a wall clock that ticked loud enough to remind everyone that time was being measured. I arrived 30 minutes early. I placed the Pelican case on the counsel table and aligned it with the table's edge. I laid out the documents in order of use. Left to right, tabs visible, no overlapping corners. The court clerk entered and tested the audio system. Testing 1, 2. The microphone hummed clean. Mark came in with a different suit, darker, sharper lines. His attorney carried 2 additional binders this time. They were thicker than before. Volume as intimidation. I didn't look at them. I reviewed my notary log instead. 3 notarizations from the last 18 months of my father's life, each stamped with the same county seal, each signed by the same notary, each time stamped within business hours, never after. Clean chronology. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He was precise in his movements, glasses adjusted once, file opened without theatrics. This matter concerns federally protected veteran assets activated under wartime contingency, he said. No drama. Just scope. Rivera presented first. She introduced the affidavit already entered into preliminary record, then added the notarized originals. The clerk walked them to the bench. The judge inspected the embossing under angled light, running a fingertip across the raised seal. Consistent, he said. Mark's attorney objected to the timing of the contingency clause, arguing that the conflict escalation did not meet the threshold defined in the affidavit. Rivera responded by submitting a Department of Defense bulletin time-stamped the morning carrier groups were repositioned. The same morning the VA flag turned from red to yellow. The bulletin contained language nearly identical to the clause in my father's affidavit. Pre-authorization under emerging hostilities. The judge compared the wording line by line. Mark shifted in his chair. I watched his jaw muscle tighten once, then release. The flip began there, not in emotion, but in alignment between documents written months apart that spoke the same language. Rivera then requested permission to introduce travel records under seal. The judge granted limited review. I unlocked the Pelican case for the first time in that room. The steel padlocks clicked open with a sound that carried. Inside, foam cut to precise shapes held a slim binder, a flash drive sealed in tamper-evident tape, and a small notebook with my father's block handwriting. No photos, no sentimental notes, just dates, locations, and corresponding reference numbers. I handed the binder to Rivera. She passed it to the bench. The judge examined the travel records, cross-referenced with the passport stamps I had already provided. Then with metadata from the flash drive, once the clerk verified the checksum on a court laptop. Checksum verified, the clerk said. Upload successful appeared in a small green bar on the screen. The visual was plain, but it felt decisive. Clean transfer. No corruption. Mark's attorney attempted a final emotional angle. He stood and addressed the court about family bonds, about how grief can distort judgment, about how my father might have intended shared stewardship rather than centralized control. He spoke carefully, appealing to humanity instead of statute. The judge listened, then asked one question. Is there any document, signed and notarized, indicating shared fiduciary authority under the protected layer? The attorney hesitated half a second too long. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then the court will rely on what is written. Mark looked at me then, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if the system had failed to respond to tone. During a brief recess, he approached me in the hallway. No cameras here, just fluorescent lights and a water fountain humming in the corner. He lowered his voice. You think this makes you bigger than the family? He asked. I didn't answer that. I said the allocations were structured for specific beneficiaries, beyond us. He frowned. He didn't know about the educational trusts, the medical reserves tied to other families. He had assumed this was about wealth concentration. I watched the realization land slowly. He tried one last plea. We can still split administrative fees. You don't have to carry all this alone. It wasn't a threat. It was habit. Transaction reflex. I told him responsibility isn't weight when it's assigned cleanly. I walked back into the courtroom before he could respond. When proceedings resumed, Rivera introduced the final document, a letter written by my father addressed not to me, not to Mark, but to designated fiduciary upon activation. It wasn't emotional. It outlined rationale. It stated that in the event of conflict involving Iran, certain networks of families affected by prior classified operations could face retaliation or financial instability. The protected assets were structured to preempt that vulnerability. My father wrote that centralized control under a code-verified individual reduced exposure to coercion. It wasn't about trust. It was about protection. The judge read the letter fully. The room stayed quiet except for the reporter's keys clicking steady. When he finished, he placed the pages down carefully, aligning them with the edge of his bench. The intent is clear, he said. This structure is protective, not accumulative. Mark exhaled sharply. A visible crack now. Not loud, but there. The judge announced that barring new evidence, the court would issue a formal order recognizing the federally verified beneficiary and dismissing the competing executor petition. The gavel came down once. A clean, contained sound. Not dramatic. Just final enough to change posture in the room. As we stood, I felt the shift not as victory, but as confirmation. The system had flipped because the documents aligned. No coincidence. No sympathy. Structure. Outside, reporters clustered near the steps, hungry for angles about secret veterans and wartime funds. I kept my answers short. The matter is procedural, I said. The record speaks. Mark left through a side exit. I watched him pause at the door, shoulders slightly lower than when he entered. Not broken, just recalibrating. My phone buzzed with a secure notification. Federal order draft ready for review. I opened the PDF and scrolled. Page after page of findings, citations, references to the affidavit, the travel records, the checksum verification. At the bottom, a line waiting for digital signature. I read every paragraph before signing. Steady, disciplined, clean. When I finally pressed confirm, the system processed for a second longer than I expected. Then the screen displayed a small confirmation. Filing accepted. The war was still escalating overseas. Carrier groups still moving. News anchors still speculating. But inside the structure my father built, activation was complete. And as the order moved into permanent record, I understood something I hadn't before. He hadn't been hiding assets. He had been shielding people. The gossip about secret wealth missed the point entirely. This was about continuity under pressure. And if the activation clause existed, there were likely additional layers I hadn't seen yet. Layers that would only reveal themselves once the first order was fully executed. The ruling didn't feel loud when it happened. It felt administrative. The formal order was issued at 9:12 a.m., time-stamped down to the second, embossed seal pressed into heavy paper that smelled faintly of ink and heat. I was standing at the clerk's counter when she slid the certified copy toward me. "Order entered," she said, voice neutral, as if confirming a delivery. I checked the case number, verified the spelling of my father's name, scanned the paragraph recognizing federally protected fiduciary control under wartime activation. Every line aligned with the draft I had reviewed the night before. No revisions. Clean entry into permanent record. That was the kill shot. Not an argument. Not a raised voice. A line in a ledger that could not be undone without higher authority. Mark was there when the clerk handed me the copy. He stood 2 steps back, hands clasped in front of him, posture no longer confident but contained. His attorney spoke first, asking about appellate options in a tone that lacked conviction. The clerk handed him a pamphlet outlining procedural timelines. 30 days to file notice. Federal review required. Bond posted. Clean hurdles, not emotional ones. Mark didn't take the pamphlet. He looked at the seal on my copy instead. His shoulders dropped half an inch. A small collapse. Visible only because I'd spent weeks watching his posture. Outside, the air was cold, the kind that sharpens edges. Reporters were thinner now. The war had produced newer headlines. A regional strike overnight. Carrier response. My father's name was no longer trending. Gossip had moved on. But inside the courthouse, the record remained. I walked down the steps without rushing. Mark followed, not beside me, but close enough to speak without microphones catching it. "You didn't have to push it this far," he said. No anger, just fatigue. I stopped at the bottom step and turned toward him. I told him I hadn't pushed anything. I had followed what was written. He rubbed a hand across his face, a gesture I had never seen from him before. "He trusted me," he said quietly. I considered that. Trust and authority are not the same line item. I told him the allocations were structured to protect families beyond ours. I explained, calmly, that the educational trusts and medical reserves were already queued for distribution through federally verified channels. He hadn't known that. I watched the realization settle in his eyes. The transaction he'd imagined wasn't available because the asset wasn't singular. It was layered across names and accounts that required disciplined oversight. He exhaled slowly, like someone recalculating a budget after discovering hidden expenses. "So there's nothing left to negotiate," he said. I shook my head once. "Not in this structure." He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back. That was the visible breakdown. Not a scene. A recalibration when the system refused to bend. I spent the rest of the morning inside a federal office 2 blocks away, finalizing the administrative transition. A compliance officer walked me through the dashboard that would manage distributions. Each beneficiary listed by coded identifier. Each allocation tied to a specific contingency description. I reviewed verification protocols. 2-factor authentication tied to hardware token and biometric scan. I signed acknowledgement forms in blue ink. Initial margin notes were required, never skipping a page. The officer asked if I intended to appoint a co-fiduciary. I said not at this time. He nodded, noted it in the system, and printed a confirmation sheet. Stamp. Initial. Scan. Upload successful. Clean transfer of authority from potential contest to validated control. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. Most people who inherit structures like this try to simplify them. Your father built redundancy. Don't dismantle it. I told him I had no intention of altering what worked. When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my phone vibrated with a notification from the court docket. Petition dismissed. Entry final. I opened the PDF and read the final paragraph. The competing executor claim is denied in its entirety. Entirety. That word carries weight when you've been living inside gray areas. I saved the document to a secure folder and backed it up to encrypted storage before even starting the car. Discipline doesn't end at the ruling. It extends through archiving. On the drive home, I passed the cemetery without planning to. The flags had been replaced, rows of white stones steady against the winter sky. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The honor was already in the record. If you respect that kind of honor, you don't just watch from the sidelines. You stay aligned with it. You subscribe to the discipline that keeps it intact. Back at the house, I walked into the study and sat at my father's desk. I opened the top drawer, checked the alignment of the notepad, the pen, the small flashlight. Nothing had shifted. I placed the certified order in a new folder labeled Activation and slid it into the second drawer with the others. Parallel edges, clean corners. The Pelican case sat on the floor beside the desk. I opened it again, removed the small notebook, and flipped to the last page. There was a short line written there that I hadn't focused on before. Responsibility transfers when verified. No signature. No flourish. Just statement. I closed the notebook and returned it to its foam cutout. For a moment, I allowed a single memory to surface. My father at the kitchen table, late at night, checking locks twice, then checking them again, not because he was afraid, but because he believed structure protected what emotion could not. I had followed that structure through institutions, through hearings, through attempts at negotiation. I had not raised my voice. I had not deviated from documentation. And because of that, the reversal had been public, clean, irreversible. Outside, a news alert buzzed on my phone about renewed tensions overseas. The activation clause had not been theoretical. It had been anticipatory. I sat there, hands resting on the desk, and understood that winning wasn't the point. Validation was. The system worked because it was built to. And somewhere in the layered accounts now moving into motion, families I hadn't met were receiving notifications that contingency funds were live. That was the quiet part no headline would cover. That was the real outcome. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was procedural. 3 days after the order was entered, certified copies arrived by registered mail to every party listed in the docket. I watched the tracking confirmations populate on the compliance dashboard like quiet check marks. Delivered. Signed. Recorded. No appeals filed within the first week. Mark's attorney submitted a formal notice declining further action on day 12. The system updated automatically at 14:03 hours. Status closed. That was the legal fallout. Not a crash. A series of clean updates that sealed the perimeter. Financial stabilization came next, and it didn't look like spending. It looked like spreadsheets. I spent mornings reviewing allocation schedules, verifying routing numbers, confirming beneficiary identities against encrypted records. Every transfer required dual authentication. Hardware token in my left hand, biometric scan with my right thumb. Code entered. Processing. Upload successful. Each time the green confirmation bar filled, it felt less like movement and more like maintenance. Funds dispersed to educational trust for 2 children in Virginia whose father had been listed in a classified casualty annex. Medical reserves activated for a widow in Texas flagged under contingency tier 3. I didn't call them. I didn't introduce myself. The structure didn't require a face. It required accuracy. I logged every action in a separate ledger, time-stamped in block print, then mirrored digitally. Redundancy. My father had built it that way. I kept it that way. The house returned to quiet. Mark stopped coming by. When we crossed paths once at the grocery store, he nodded, no bitterness in his expression, just the kind of distance that comes after recalculation. The gossip cycle ended faster than it started. Without conflict, there's nothing to feed it. People moved on to other rumors, other headlines about the war. I did not move on. I adjusted. I set my alarm for 0500 again. Shoes aligned by the door. Keys placed on the ceramic dish. Coffee measured, not guessed. I resumed running 3 miles before sunrise, same route my father used to take, pace steady, breathing disciplined. Money had entered my control, but it hadn't entered my routine. That was intentional. I kept my job. I declined invitations to speak at veterans panels about legacy wealth. Legacy is a word that attracts the wrong attention. What existed was responsibility. On the 14th day after the ruling, a secure message arrived from the four-star who had handed me the envelope at the chapel. Continuity confirmed, it read. 2 words. No signature blocked beyond rank. I archived it in the activation folder and printed a hard copy for the drawer. Some confirmations deserve physical storage. Later that week, I received a request from a federal auditor for a random compliance review. Not because of suspicion, because the structure demanded periodic validation. I welcomed it. I provided logs, timestamps, checksum verifications. The auditor noted no discrepancies. Clean administration, he wrote in the final report. That phrase carried more weight than any public praise could have. At night, I sometimes sat at the desk and reread the letter my father had written to the designated fiduciary upon activation. Not for sentiment, for calibration. I traced the lines describing how centralized control reduced coercion risk during geopolitical instability. He had anticipated not just the war, but the pressure that war exerts on families connected to invisible operations. Protection wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. Reduce variables. Increase stability. Maintain record. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows in steady rhythm, I opened the small notebook from the Pelican case again. There was one page I hadn't examined closely before, a list of initials next to numbered tiers. I cross-referenced them with the beneficiary dashboard and realized they corresponded to contingency expansions that had not yet activated. Future layers. My father hadn't built a single response. He had built scalability. That realization didn't excite me. It grounded me. The work wasn't finished because the first order was entered. It continued as long as the global environment remained unstable. I updated the ledger with a new section labeled monitoring. War doesn't end on command. Neither does responsibility. On the anniversary of his burial, I returned to the chapel. No cameras, no authority figures, just the smell of floor wax and the echo of footsteps. I stood in the same spot where the envelope had rested on the podium and let the quiet settle. I didn't speak out loud. I didn't need to. The proof was already filed. On the drive back, I thought about discipline and greed, how one demands repetition and the other demands acceleration. Greed wants immediate control. Discipline wants verified transfer. I had seen both approaches in the same room and watched which one survived contact with documentation. The war overseas continued to generate headlines, but inside the structure my father left, there was no panic. Only process. I arrived home before dusk, aligned my shoes, placed the keys on the dish, and checked the locks twice. Doors are clean when they close flush. Records are clean when they close twice. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hand resting on the deadbolt, and considered the question that lingers after everything stabilizes. When pressure comes, do you reach for quick gain or for verified structure? The answer determines more than inheritance. It determines what survives when the noise fades.